What happens when Hollywood's most respected veteran actor comes face to face with a talk show host who refuses to back down from the most controversial topics? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits across from Kelly Clarkson in what starts as a seemingly innocent conversation, but quickly spirals into television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Last night's episode delivered the kind of raw, unfiltered drama that had viewers glued to their screens and social media buzzing with shocked reactions. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two powerhouses collide in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The stage was set for what everyone expected to be another feel-good episode of The Kelly Clarkson Show. Denzel Washington, the two-time Academy Award winner and undisputed king of Hollywood gravitas, had arrived to promote his latest directorial project. The audience was packed with fans eagerly anticipating insights from one of cinema's most revered figures. But what started as promotional appearances quickly transformed into something far more volatile. Kelly Clarkson, known for her bubbly personality and seemingly harmless questions, had apparently done her homework on Washington's recent interviews, where he'd been increasingly vocal about Hollywood's treatment of veteran black actors and the industry's superficial approach to diversity. Sources backstage revealed that Clarkson had been preparing talking points that would push Washington on these sensitive topics, despite her producers' warnings about the actor's well-documented preference for keeping interviews focused on his work rather than industry politics. The tension began building from the moment Washington walked onto the set. His usual warm smile seemed more reserved, his handshake with Clarkson noticeably brief. Audience members later described feeling an unusual energy in the studio, as if something was simmering beneath the surface. The veteran actor took his seat with a measured composure that had made him a legend, but those who knew him well could detect the subtle signs of a man preparing for battle. Clarkson opened with her trademark enthusiasm, welcoming Washington with effusive praise for his decades-long career. "Denzel, you've been blessing us with incredible performances for over 40 years," she gushed, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness that had become her signature. "But I have to ask, and I know our audience is curious about this too, you've been pretty outspoken lately about Hollywood's diversity issues. Some people are saying you're being too harsh on an industry that's given you so much success." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just been thrown at him. The audience fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. This wasn't the light-hearted conversation they'd been expecting. "I'm sorry. What exactly are you suggesting?" Washington's voice carried that distinctive gravelly tone, but there was an edge to it that made even the camera operators shift uncomfortably. "Are you implying that I should be grateful for scraps? That I should stay quiet about systemic issues because I've managed to succeed despite them?" Clarkson's smile faltered for just a moment, before she quickly recovered, leaning forward with false concern. "Oh no, that's not what I meant at all. I just think, when you have such a platform and influence, maybe there's a more positive way to address these things. I mean, look at how far we've come. You're sitting here as one of the most successful actors in history." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Washington's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, his posture shifting from relaxed to defensive. "Are you seriously lecturing me about how to use my platform?" His voice remained controlled, but there was a dangerous undertone that made the studio audience exchange nervous glances. "You think I don't know what I'm talking about when I speak about my own experiences in this industry?" The confrontation was escalating rapidly, with Clarkson seemingly oblivious to the line she had crossed. "I'm just saying, Denzel, that maybe instead of focusing on the negative, we could celebrate the positive changes. I mean, look at all the opportunities that exist now compared to when you started." Washington's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Opportunities? You want to talk about opportunities?" He leaned forward, his intensity filling the space between them. "Do you know what it's like to be told you're too black for a role? To have executives suggest you should be more palatable to mainstream audiences? To watch lesser talents get opportunities simply because they fit a certain image?" The audience was now completely silent, transfixed by the raw emotion emanating from the Hollywood legend. Clarkson, however, seemed determined to double down on her position. But surely you have to admit that things are different now. The industry has evolved, and there are so many more diverse voices being heard. Evolved? Washington's voice rose slightly, his famous composure beginning to crack. You think a few token gestures constitute evolution? You think because there are more black faces in commercials and a handful of diversity initiatives that the fundamental problems have been solved? The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Crew members were glancing at each other nervously, unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out. Clarkson's producers were frantically gesturing from the sidelines, but she seemed either oblivious to their signals or determined to push forward. I understand your frustration, Clarkson said, her tone taking on a patronizing quality that made Washington's eyes flash dangerously. But don't you think that your success story could inspire other young black actors instead of discouraging them with all this talk about barriers and limitations? The question was the verbal equivalent of lighting a fuse. Washington's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles visibly tightening. My success story? He repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think my success happened in a vacuum? You think I didn't have to fight for every single opportunity, every single role, every single moment of respect? The atmosphere in the studio had become electric with tension. Even the audience members, who had been excited to see their favorite actor, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was two worldviews colliding in the most public way possible. Clarkson, seemingly unaware of the volcano she had awakened, pressed on with her line of questioning. I'm just trying to understand why someone who has achieved so much would want to focus on the negative aspects of their journey. Isn't there something to be said for gratitude and positivity? The word gratitude hit Washington like a physical blow. His entire demeanor shifted, and those who knew him well could see that something fundamental had just snapped. The careful control he had maintained throughout his career, the diplomatic responses he had perfected over decades of interviews, all of it was about to be abandoned in favor of raw, unfiltered truth. But just as Washington opened his mouth to respond, just as it became clear that this confrontation was about to reach a point of no return, Clarkson made a decision that would push the entire situation beyond any hope of recovery. What she said next would transform this tense exchange into something far more explosive, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic exits in talk show history. Well, Denzel, Clarkson interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. I think you might be playing the victim card a little bit here. I've interviewed plenty of successful actors of all backgrounds, and most of them managed to stay positive about their experiences. Maybe the real issue is your attitude about the whole thing. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The studio fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Washington's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something far more dangerous. His eyes locked onto Clarkson's with an intensity that made several audience members actually lean back in their seats. My attitude? Washington's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than if he had been shouting. Did you just tell me that my attitude is the problem? That decades of documented discrimination, of fighting for roles that should have been mine by merit, of watching opportunities go to less qualified actors because of the color of my skin, that's an attitude problem? Clarkson seemed to realize she had stepped into dangerous territory, but instead of backing down, she doubled down with a nervous laugh. I'm just saying that maybe if you approach these conversations with more solutions instead of complaints, people might be more receptive to your message. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? The comparison was the final straw. Washington's composure, built over decades of professionalism, crumbled completely. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising with each word. Are you comparing the systematic exclusion of black actors to catching flies? Are you seriously sitting there, as a white woman who has never faced a single barrier based on her race, telling me how to discuss my own oppression? The audience was now completely transfixed by the raw emotion pouring from the Hollywood legend. Some were pulling out their phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something historic. Clarkson's producers were making frantic cutting motions from behind the cameras, but she seemed determined to dig herself even deeper. "I think you're taking this too personally," Clarkson said, her voice taking on that infuriating tone of someone who believes they're being reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. "I'm just trying to have a balanced conversation about these issues. Surely you can see that there are multiple perspectives here." "Multiple perspectives?" Washington's laugh was sharp and bitter. "What's your perspective on being told you're too threatening for a romantic lead? What's your perspective on having your intelligence questioned in script meetings? What's your perspective on being asked to tone down your natural speaking voice because it might intimidate white audiences?" The questions came like rapid-fire bullets, each one hitting its mark with devastating precision. Clarkson's face was beginning to show the strain of trying to maintain her composure while clearly being overwhelmed by the intensity of Washington's response. "Look, I understand that you've had some difficult experiences," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But don't you think that focusing on the past prevents us from moving forward? Isn't it better to look toward the future with optimism rather than dwelling on old grievances?" The phrase "old grievances" was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. Washington stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone in the studio jump. "Old grievances? Are you out of your mind? These aren't old grievances. This is ongoing reality. Do you think racism just disappeared because you decided it was time to move on?" Clarkson remained seated, but her confident demeanor was rapidly cracking. "I didn't say racism disappeared. I'm just suggesting that, maybe, as someone with your platform and success, you could use your influence to promote unity instead of division." "Unity?" Washington's voice echoed through the studio. "You want to talk about unity? How about the unity of acknowledging that there's still work to be done? How about the unity of actually listening to the experiences of people who don't look like you instead of dismissing them as attitude problems?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with Washington now pacing slightly behind his chair, his hands gesturing emphatically as he spoke. The audience was completely silent, mesmerized by the raw emotion and authentic anger of one of Hollywood's most respected figures. But Clarkson, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment, chose to escalate even further. "I just think that, when you're in a position of privilege like yours, you have a responsibility to be more constructive in your criticism. You've made millions of dollars. You've won awards. You've been celebrated by audiences worldwide. At what point do you stop seeing yourself as a victim and start seeing yourself as a success story?" The word "victim" was the breaking point. Washington stopped pacing and turned to face Clarkson directly, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the studio lights seem dim by comparison. "A victim? You think I see myself as a victim? I see myself as a survivor. I see myself as someone who has fought for every single thing I've achieved, in spite of a system designed to keep me out." His voice rose to a level that made the microphone strain to capture every word. "And you know what the most insulting part of this entire conversation is? It's that you think your comfort is more important than my truth. You think your need to feel good about the world is more important than my need to speak honestly about my experiences." The studio was now charged with an electrical tension that made everyone present feel like they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a disagreement between a host and guest. This was a fundamental clash of worldviews playing out in real time. Clarkson's voice became smaller, more defensive. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I'm just trying to have a conversation about these issues in a way that's productive for everyone watching." "Productive for everyone?" Washington's incredulous laugh filled the studio. "You mean productive for white people who don't want to hear about the reality of racism? Productive for people who want to pretend that everything is fine so they can sleep better at night?" The confrontation had now reached a point where there was no going back. Both host and guest had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, said things that couldn't be unsaid. The tension in the studio was so thick it was almost suffocating, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But just as it seemed like the situation couldn't possibly get any more explosive, just as it appeared that Washington might actually walk off the set in that moment, Clarkson made one final, devastating comment that would push the entire confrontation into territory that no one could have predicted. "You know what, Denzel?" Clarkson's voice took on a sharp edge that nobody in the studio had ever heard before. "Maybe the reason you're so angry about all of this is because deep down, you know that some of those roles you didn't get weren't about race at all. Maybe they just went to better actors. Maybe it's easier to blame racism than to admit that sometimes you just weren't the right fit." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crew members who had been frantically trying to signal for commercial breaks stopped moving entirely. The audience collectively held its breath, knowing that something irreversible had just happened. Washington's face went through a transformation that was almost frightening to witness, from shock to fury to something that looked almost like pity. "Better actors?" Washington's voice was dangerously quiet, each word articulated with surgical precision. "Did you just suggest that I lost roles to better actors? That my career, my achievements, my legacy might be inflated because I've been using racism as an excuse for my own inadequacies?" Clarkson's face had gone pale, but she seemed incapable of stopping herself. "I'm just saying that in a competitive industry like Hollywood, sometimes the best actor gets the job. That's how it should work, right? Merit-based casting?" Washington took a step closer to her chair, his presence now dominating the entire set. "Merit-based casting? Let me tell you about merit-based casting, Kelly. Let me tell you about the time I auditioned for a role that eventually went to a white actor with half my experience and a tenth of my training. Let me tell you about the director who told me I was the best audition he'd seen, but that the studio wouldn't greenlight a black leading man." His voice grew stronger with each word, decades of suppressed frustration pouring out in a torrent of raw truth. "Let me tell you about the times I was told I was too intense for romantic comedies, too serious for action films, too black for period pieces. And you want to sit there and tell me that was about merit?" The studio audience was now completely captivated, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed this unprecedented moment of vulnerability from one of Hollywood's most guarded stars. But Clarkson, seemingly unable to recognize the magnitude of what she had unleashed, continued her assault. "I'm just trying to present a balanced view," she said, her voice becoming increasingly defensive. "Maybe some of those decisions were about racism, but maybe some weren't. Maybe some of those roles really did go to actors who were more suited for them. Isn't it possible that you're seeing discrimination where there might have been other factors?" Washington's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Other factors? What other factors could there be when a casting director literally tells you that you're perfect for a role except for your race? What other factors explain being asked to audition for the villain in a movie where you clearly belonged as the hero?" He began pacing again, his movements sharp and aggressive. "You want to talk about merit? I've been nominated for 8 Academy Awards. I've won 2. I've been in the industry for over 4 decades. I've trained at some of the most prestigious institutions in the world. And you're sitting there suggesting that my concerns about racism might just be excuses for professional failures?" The confrontation had reached a level of intensity that was almost unbearable to watch. Clarkson's producers were making desperate signals from behind the cameras, but she seemed determined to defend her position regardless of the consequences. "I'm not diminishing your achievements," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm just saying that maybe, just maybe, not every disappointment in your career was about race. Maybe some of it was just the natural competition of the industry." "Natural competition?" Washington's voice rose to a roar that echoed through the studio. "You call it natural competition when black actors are systematically excluded from entire genres? When we're told that international markets won't accept us as leading men? When we're pigeonholed into the same types of roles over and over again?" He stopped pacing and fixed Clarkson with a stare that seemed to look right through her. "You know what the real problem is here, Kelly. It's not my attitude. It's not my inability to be grateful. It's that you've lived your entire life in a bubble where you've never had to question whether your success was earned or given. You've never had to wonder if you got a job because of your talent or because you fit a certain image. The truth of his words hit like a physical blow. Clarkson's face crumpled slightly, but she still couldn't seem to stop herself from responding. That's not fair. I've worked hard for everything I have. I've faced my own challenges in this industry. Your own challenges? Washington's voice was filled with incredulous disbelief. What challenges? Being told you're too bubbly? Too sweet? Too likable? Those are your challenges? Compare that to being told you're too threatening, too angry, too black. Compare that to having your intelligence questioned, your professionalism doubted, your very humanity debated. The emotional weight of his words was crushing. Several audience members were openly crying now, moved by the raw pain and frustration in Washington's voice. But what came next would push the situation beyond any hope of recovery. You know what? Clarkson's voice took on a defensive, almost petulant tone. Maybe if you spent less time complaining about the past and more time focusing on the future, you'd be happier. Maybe if you stopped looking for racism in every interaction, you'd find more opportunities. Maybe the real barrier to your success isn't Hollywood. Maybe it's you. The studio went completely silent. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. Washington's face went through a series of emotions: shock, hurt, fury, and finally, something that looked almost like relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice suddenly calm and controlled. "Thank you for showing everyone exactly who you are. Thank you for proving every point I've been trying to make. Thank you for demonstrating that even in 2025, even after everything we've been through as a society, there are still people who believe that racism is just a choice that black people make." He walked back to his chair, but instead of sitting down, he began removing his microphone. "You want to know what the real tragedy is here? It's that you have this platform, this ability to reach millions of people, and you're using it to perpetuate the same harmful narratives that have been used to silence marginalized voices for decades." His hands moved with deliberate precision as he unclipped the microphone pack from his jacket. "You're telling your audience that if black people just stopped complaining about racism, it would go away. You're telling them that our pain is our choice, that our struggles are our fault, that our experiences are invalid." Clarkson watched in horror as Washington prepared to leave, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done. "Denzel, please, I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to have a conversation about these issues from different perspectives." "Different perspectives?" Washington's voice was filled with cold fury. "There's no different perspective on racism, Kelly. There's reality, and there's denial. There's truth, and there's willful ignorance. And you've made it very clear which side you're on." He stood to his full height, his presence commanding the entire studio. "I've spent my entire career trying to bridge gaps, trying to build understanding, trying to be the kind of representative for my community that would make positive change. But I'm done being diplomatic with people who refuse to acknowledge basic truths about the world we live in." The microphone clattered to the floor as he released it, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. "This conversation is over. This interview is over. And frankly, my patience with people like you is over." Washington began walking toward the exit, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the chaos erupting around him. Clarkson called after him, her voice desperate and pleading. "Denzel, please don't leave like this. We can work this out. We can have a real conversation about these issues." He paused at the edge of the set and turned back to face her one final time. "We just did have a real conversation, Kelly. And it revealed everything I need to know about you, about this show, and about the kind of platform you're providing to discuss these issues." His final words carried the weight of decades of experience, of battles fought and won, of a legacy that would outlast any temporary controversy. "I hope your audience learned something from this. I hope they understand that when we talk about racism, we're not asking for sympathy or special treatment. We're asking for acknowledgement of reality. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then that's something you need to examine within yourself." With that, Denzel Washington walked off the set of The Kelly Clarkson Show, leaving behind a stunned studio, a devastated host, and a moment that would be dissected and discussed for years to come. The silence that followed his exit was profound, filled with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back, and a confrontation that had revealed truths that some people weren't ready to hear. The cameras continued rolling, capturing Clarkson's shell-shocked expression and the bewildered faces of the audience members who had witnessed television history in the making. What had started as a promotional interview had become something far more significant, a moment of raw honesty that exposed the deep divisions that still exist in our society and the work that still needs to be done to bridge them.